Russia claims Kiev's putting Europe under nuclear threat by shelling areas near a nuclear power plant in Ukraine's south. That's for the second time in 2 days. Here's footage from the area released by local authorities, which shows cluster munitions launched by Ukrainian rocket launchers littering an area near the active plant. A previous attack took place on Friday, which sparked a fire at the facility and left some power lines linked to the plant down. Russia has previously warned that a direct hit on the plant's reactors could cause a disaster worse than Chernobyl. Let's go live now to Richard Black, a former Republican Party senator for Virginia. Senator, local officials are saying that the Ukrainian rockets have fallen near the power plant for the second time in 2 days. What do you make of these developments?
Well, the interesting thing is that Russian forces took over Zaporizhzhia back in March. So the Russian forces hold that area. And what is happening, the Russians do have some artillery units that are close to the power plants. The Ukrainians are launching an offensive. We don't know how much it'll amount to, but it's an offensive against Kherson. And in the process, they want to take out these artillery batteries that are near the power plants. Now, we have Zelensky. He's sort of always in an outrage about something. And the latest thing is he is, as I understand, he's blaming the Russians for shelling their own positions at the power plants. These are Russian positions. The power plants are held under Russian control by Russian army. And somehow Zelensky is trying to say that I guess that the Russians are shelling themselves at the power plants. It's really quite bizarre, but it's part of the whole propaganda mix that is designed to confuse people. Really, people get very concerned when they have fighting surrounding these nuclear power plants. This is the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. And so to somehow damage one of these container vessels and release radiation would be quite a disaster for Ukraine and for Russia. Nobody wants that to happen, but the Ukrainian army, I'm convinced it has to be them firing the shells because Russians are not going to fire shells at themselves. So it has to be the Ukrainians doing it. And I think they're taking a very grave risk when they do it. Amnesty International has raised very deep concerns about the shelling that's taking place. And I think it should not be taking place. I think Ukraine needs to order its forces to stop shelling near the Zaporizhzhia power plant and leave that off limits, because we certainly don't need to have a leak like we had years ago at Chernobyl. I think this is a matter for the Ukrainians to control. Russians can't control when Ukrainians fire shells at their batteries that are near the power plants.
Does it look like Ukraine's military is aware of the dangers of attacking the power plant?
I don't think they care. I think to them, they're willing to take risks of enormous magnitude. For example, they work very closely with the United States Central Intelligence Agency in launching the attack on the flagship, the Moskva, which sank the flagship. And that was just an extraordinarily reckless, insane provocation. And it just shows the lack of responsibility within the Ukrainian government. And I think it stems from Zelensky. I do not think Zelensky is a responsible individual. I think he is very reckless, and I think at some point the Ukrainian general staff is going to have to remove that fellow from office because he's just making decisions that are irrational.
The IAEA is aware of the risk associated with the shelling of the plant. So why is it reluctant to take any concrete steps to prevent any catastrophe?
Right now, there's such enormous force from the West, from the US, from NATO, from the United Kingdom, this tremendous pressure from the Western media to never say anything bad about Ukraine and to make up any kind of thing that you can say against the Russians. That's becoming a little bit frayed. The information is beginning to leak out, and people are beginning to say, you know, wait a minute. It wasn't Russia that started this war. It was NATO that started the war because they forced Russia's back to the wall where President Putin, he had no alternative but to defend the sovereign territory of Russia, and he had to launch an attack to do that in order to preempt the attack that Ukraine was planning against the Donbass. So we see a gradual shift in the political environment, and now you see more people beginning to slowly, cautiously speak out and say, you know, this Ukraine war never made any sense. We're slaughtering good, decent Ukrainian young men. We're slaughtering good, decent Russian young men. And for what? So that the sons of very well-connected politicians in the US, the UK, some of these other countries can go out and cut deals for arms. Now, we don't know where those arms are going. The latest reports are saying that perhaps 70% of the arms are being diverted by oligarchs and warlords in Ukraine, and they're being farmed out. They're being sold on the black market. They're making it to the Middle East. They're making it to organized crime elements. Extremely dangerous things are happening. This whole war in Ukraine has turned out to be so counterproductive for NATO, for the United States, obviously for Ukraine, and for Russia, for the entire world. And the sooner that we can bring it to a close and recognize that, okay, this was a disaster, it was a war that never should have happened. There never should have been one Ukrainian or one Russian die. We should have talked it through, resolved the issues, recognized that Russia has vital national interest, and that the Russians, President Putin, they had their backs forced to the wall. Now, when this happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States had its back to the wall, and we were prepared to launch an attack against Cuba. I was out snake hunting as a young teenage boy. I was out in a very desolate area, and I saw the largest military convoy of my entire life. And it was headed down to South Florida. They were going to board landing ships. They were going to invade Cuba. The Soviet Union recognized, they said, okay, this is a vital national interest of the United States. They're going to be willing to fight for it. We'll cut a deal. And what we did, the Soviets pulled the nuclear missiles from Cuba, and in return, we pulled our nuclear missiles out of Turkey, and peace was the result. So we didn't have people dying in massive numbers in Cuba. We didn't make that analysis when what happened is back in 2014, President Obama launched a plan to overthrow the government of Ukraine, the legitimately elected government of Ukraine, and then he began pouring advanced missiles and rockets into Ukraine. and those were used to make the attack on the Donbass, and that war has raged for ever
Mr.
since
Black, sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned the shifting media narrative, and I think that's an important point. You said that the media has started to realize things, right? And a recent Amnesty International report focuses on the use of human shields by Kiev, and the findings have sparked fury in Western media. And Ukraine now has forced Amnesty's Ukraine chapter chief to quit. Why do you think the media shift? Why do you think such a reaction?
Well, it's kind of amazing that Ukrainian International has been able, or that Amnesty International has been able to publish this. I think 3 months ago they never could have. But what they've done is they have gone in and they have actually had people on the ground examining these sites where artillery fire took place. And they have concluded, Amnesty International concluded, that the Ukrainians have systematically posted their artillery batteries near public schools and hospitals. And in doing that, they did not warn the residents of these areas. They didn't say, okay, you need to get out because this is a war zone. And as a consequence, there were civilians there. And so the Ukrainians would fire artillery, and then the Russians would immediately fire counter battery artillery. And some of those artillery shells would hit right next to civilian areas. There was one report that kind of stood out in my mind. There was a young woman in one of the towns in Donbass, and there was a Ukrainian military post right next to her house, and her son would sometimes go over and visit. And she warned her son, she said, don't do that, it's very dangerous. And one day he walked across the yard over to where the Ukrainian troops were, and there was counter battery fire. It hit, it exploded, and she said it just tore him to shreds. And of course, the mother is brokenhearted. It never should have happened. The Ukrainians had no right to do this. And what they're doing is they're posting these artillery batteries where they know the Russians are forced to fire back and it will cause civilian casualties. Then they turn around and they blame it on the Russians. It's not the Russians' fault, it's the Ukrainians' fault, and they need to cut it out.
And how long do you think the West is going to turn a blind eye to such alleged war crimes by Kiev, especially with the shifting narrative?
Ukraine has committed some horrific war crimes, well-established war crimes. Meanwhile, the mainstream media has blamed a lot of very vague things on the Russians. The principal crime that was pinned on the Russians was the Bucha massacre, is what they called. I saw these. Now, I was a very senior prosecutor for the U.S. Army JAG Corps. I oversaw thousands of cases. I was responsible for military justice across the world when we had 750,000 troops. And I looked at this video from Ukraine, and it immediately struck me as not believable, because you had bodies that were spaced right along a public road. They had their hands behind their backs. I noticed, first of all, that their armbands were white. They were not blue. Now, the Ukrainian sympathizers wore blue armbands. So none of the sympathizers were killed. It was only the ones who were Russian sympathizers who were killed. The other thing, now, there has recently been a very credible witness. He was a French military man who volunteered to serve and to work as a volunteer with the Ukrainian army. So he was right in with the Azov battalion, and he stated on television with his name, with his picture published. He said, I was just amazed. He said, I went there. He said, I had to be very careful what I said because I needed to seem like I was sympathetic. But he said, I would see a bunch of captives, Russian captives, captured by the Ukrainians, and they would yell at the troops and they'd say, where are your officers? And as soon as they identified where the officers were, they put a gun to their head and they killed them. They just executed them. These kinds of crimes are very well established. They've been going on, and it's quite clear that Zelensky is doing nothing to restrain the criminal conduct of some of his forces. On the other hand, from everything that I can observe, the Russian command from President Putin on down has been very careful about acting in a way that is consistent with the Geneva Conventions, treating people in a humane fashion. I do not see that happening on the Russian or on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians have been very, very brutal. We had a report from someone who ran a hospital, and he said that he gave strict instructions to his doctors that whenever there was a wounded Russian soldier in, they were to immediately castrate him. Now, this is a horrific war crime. It was never denied by Ukraine, never denied by Zelensky, but they basically sort of kicked it off. They said, well, we'll take a look into it. There have been similar things. There was a 7-minute video where there were members of one of these very right-wing battalions, and they were just shooting Russian POWs as they came into the POW collection point. They were putting plastic bags over their heads so that they couldn't breathe, and they had their hands tied behind their back so that they couldn't remove the bags and be able to breathe air. And then the video ends, and there are 3 uninjured Russian POWs who step off of a van, and immediately, without the slightest hesitation, the Ukrainians shot them with high-powered rifles in the legs. They both collapsed and fell. The third man fell on his knees and begged not to be shot, and they shot him right away. This is a war crime that was not contested. And then you compare that to Bucha, where the bodies in Bucha never showed up until 4 days after the Ukrainian army had moved in. They never gave any explanation why, if the Russians were for some reason going to execute a bunch of people, why did they wait 6 weeks to do it? Why didn't they take them out in the woods where they could hide the evidence? No, it was all staged, and that's what the French observer testified to.
Richard Black, former Republican Virginia senator, thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having me.